So we are going to begin our series on Ecclesiastes, the search for purpose, the meaning of life, a lot of different phrases that can be used to describe this book, but it's a personal journey of a man who made decisions to take the goodness of God and the gift of God and turn it inward, searching for purpose outside of his relationship to Jehovah. And that is relevant for our culture today. I'm sure there have been times in your life and my life that we have identified with Solomon in finding satisfaction and purpose in one thing or another outside of the relationship with God. And so there are going to be valuable lessons that we will learn over the weeks to come. So let's talk about the book itself, and then we're going to talk about who is Solomon. The title Ecclesiastes comes from a Greek word indicating a person who calls an assembly, hence the reference to preacher in verse 1 of Ecclesiastes. The writer refers to him as the son of David. The writer refers to himself as king of Jerusalem. So we can conclude with confidence that the writer of the book of Ecclesiastes is none other than King Solomon. One scholar attempted to offer evidence that it wasn't King Solomon, but a 17th or 18th line down the line son of David that wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, but this cannot be substantiated. Solomon also penned most of the book of Proverbs and all of the Song of Solomon, and some refer to the Song of Solomon as the Song of Songs. We will also discover from 1 Kings 4:32, Solomon wrote over 3,000 parables and over 1,000 songs. And in verse 32, it says, he also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He was quite a literary genius, if you please. Proverbs offers a tremendous amount of wisdom. I am not totally familiar with any of the songs that Solomon wrote, but they would be more than likely if any of them were incorporated by the Spirit of God in the book of Psalms. Now, Ecclesiastes is one of the 5 wisdom or poetry books of the Bible. The Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, is broken down into like a library containing certain books. For example, you have the books of history in the Old Testament. You have the books here of wisdom or poetry. You have the prophetic books. In the New Testament, you have the Gospels, and you have a historical book in Acts, and then you have the general epistles, and then you have Pauline epistles. So Ecclesiastes is in the middle of your Bible as a rule, and it would be known as one of the 5 wisdom books or poetry books. Ecclesiastes is a reflective diary written near the end of Solomon's life, prior to his death at age 82, around 931 BC. Solomon, unlike the book of Proverbs, is not writing to his sons. If you read Proverbs chapter 1, he addresses his sons. Listen, my sons, to what I'm about to say. Don't ignore what your father and your mother have to say. And the first 10 or 11 chapters are his attempts to teach his children from events in his life. But in the book of Ecclesiastes, there is no particular addressee found. So he is later on in his life, after chapter 12, when he finally acknowledges the many years of error in his life. This is a diary, a reflective diary, a memoir of Solomon's life as recorded in the book of Ecclesiastes. This is what life is like if you desert God, if you abandon God, if you turn your heart away from God. The repetitive phrases announce the theme of the book. The phrase "under the sun" is used approximately 30 times. Now that's a lot in 12 chapters. Under the sun. And what it does, this phrase, it describes life on earth without influence or direction from Yahweh. It's a man living under the sun. He can have everything under the sun, and still his life will be meaningless, without purpose, without direction, floundering around, thinking that the next event, the next project will bring him satisfaction. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. In Ecclesiastes 1:1, the word vanity is chasing after wind. The word vanity and chasing after wind is repeated 31 times. In the original Hebrew, it means vapor or breath. It is continuous and fleeting. Fleeting. Who can harness the wind? Who can grasp the wind? And the answer is no one can. And so these two phrases, under the sun, and then vanity and chasing after wind, reinforce after every one of Solomon's projects he put his hand to find purpose and meaning, describe the outcome. He undertook a building project, and at the end, this is vanity and chasing after wind. He collected servants. This is vanity, chasing after wind. Everything his sinful heart sought to find meaning and purpose in, that he laid his feeble hand to, only resulted in emptiness and the pursuit of something else he thought would give him meaning. Now let's talk about the author. So turn to 1 Kings, and I want to go through 1 Kings, the first 11 chapters, and show you Solomon's background and his life. So what do we know about Solomon? Well, the first thing that we should note is that Bathsheba was Solomon's mother. He was Bathsheba's second son. The first son, by the adulterous relationship with David, perished. So Solomon was the second son between David and Bathsheba. 1 Kings 1:1 says that Nathan spoke to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon. And so David and Bathsheba were the parents of Solomon. We also note in verses 12 to 37 that there is a political coup and Solomon's life is in danger. Verse 12 says this, "So now come, please let me give you counsel and save your life and the life of your son Solomon. Go at once to King David and say to him, have you not, my lord, O king, swore to your maid servant, saying, surely Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne? Why then is Adonijah becoming king? Behold, while you are still there speaking with the king, I will come in after you and confirm your words." So what Nathan is doing, if you go back to verse 11, he is prepping Bathsheba to approach her husband who made a commitment that Solomon would be the next heir to the throne, not Adonijah. Verse 15, so Bathsheba went into the king in the bedroom. Now the king was very old, and Abishai, the Shulamite, was ministering to the king. Then Bathsheba bowed down and prostrated herself before the king, and the king said, "What do you wish?" She said to him, "My lord, you swore to your maidservant by the Lord your God, saying, surely your son Solomon shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne. Now behold, Adonijah is king. And now, my lord the king, you do not know it. He has sacrificed oxen and fatlings and sheep in abundance, and has invited all the sons of the king, and Abiathar the priest, and Joab the commander of the army, but he has not invited Solomon your servant. As for you now, my lord the king, the eyes of all Israel are on you, to tell them who shall sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Otherwise it will come about, as soon as my lord the king sleeps with his fathers, that I and my son Solomon will be considered offenders. Behold, while she was still speaking with the king, Nathan the prophet came in, and I'm going to stop here, and confirmed the story. Verse 28, David said, call Bathsheba to me, and she came into the king's presence and stood before the king. And the king vowed and said, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all distress, surely as I vowed to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, saying, your son Solomon shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place. I will indeed do so this day. But there is a political coup that is taking place with Adonijah. He wants to be king. He was firstborn of David and another woman, and he felt like he should be king. Now, when a new heir came to the throne, and if it was determined that others who wanted to be king or in powerful political positions, they would be executed. They would be removed because it would be viewed as a political and military coup. And so this is what David is going to charge Solomon to do in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 to 9. And I'm not going to read that for you, but he charges David to put certain people to death, like in chapter 2, verse 19, Adonijah. And then at chapter 2, verse 28, Joab. And chapter 2, verse 36, Shimei. And so David, who promised that Shimei would not be harmed, which he did not himself personally harm Shimei, because he said publicly he recognized that God was saving him from first-degree murder, yet he commissions his son to execute Shimei that he deferred from doing, which might reveal a part of David's final heart before he slept with his fathers. Solomon purges his military and political enemies in chapter 2, 19 to 46. I just touched on the highlights. I did not read it all. Now, Solomon's dialogue with Jehovah. This is very important. Beginning in verse 1. David has died. The military potential insurrectionists have been removed. And it says that Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. Now, first of all, this should strike you that Solomon has no business entering into a racially, spiritually mixed marriage of all people with Pharaoh's daughter, king of Egypt, in light of the history of Israel with the Egyptians. But Solomon will do this a number of times. And what this means is, as long as Pharaoh's daughter was well cared for and lived, there would be no military advancement by either Egypt or by Israel. But if something were to happen to the daughter, then there would be a military skirmish. And Solomon made many of these military alliances through marriage. And we will see how many wives he had and how many concubines. Goes on to say in verse 2, the people were still sacrificing on the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burnt incense on the high places. This is turning the page of seeing the downward spiral in Solomon's life. We have politically motivated, spiritually mixed marriages, and Solomon is worshiping on the high places where idolatry took place. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high price. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. In Gibeah, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, "Ask what you wish to give. Ask what you wish me to give you." I find this ironic that Solomon, after offering 1,000 burnt offerings at a high place of demonic worship, God appears to him and says, "Ask whatever you will, and I will give it to you." God is testing his love and allegiance. Verse 4 says, I turned one too many pages here. Verse 6. Then Solomon said, "You have shown great loving kindness to your servant David my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart towards you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on the throne, as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in." Is this a reflection of David's relationship with his children and the lack of parental teaching and guidance? Well, I think it is if you go back and look at the terrible family disorder that took place where David tolerated his son to commit incest with Tamar, refused to discipline him, brought him back, heard of his attempts to have an insurrection, did nothing about it, fled, and then when the son was put to death, he wept and wished that he had died instead of Absalom. So I think this is a reflection. Solomon is reflecting I haven't been trained. I don't know how to rule people. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. This would be a reflection of David's advancement of the kingdom during his reign. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? And then God answers and commends Solomon that he didn't ask for land and silver and gold, and God granted to him a communicable gift. I hope you caught that word, communicable. The attributes of God fall into two categories: communicable, non-communicable. Communicable means that there are certain attributes that God has that he gives to us for ministry and the advancement of the kingdom. For example, here with Solomon, it would be wisdom or love or mercy. Non-communicable gifts are the attributes of God that belong only to him. Such attributes as eternal, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent. Those are examples of non-communicable gifts. So God rewards Solomon. Now we see the example of this wisdom that God gave to him right off the bat in chapter 3, verse 16 and following of the story of the two harlots. They were cohabitating together. Each had a child. Each slept with the child in the bed, probably for the convenience of nursing. But one of the harlots rolled over on her child and suffocated the baby and claimed that her roommate stole her baby. And so they come to Solomon to determine who is the mother. Now, they don't have DNA testing back then or Ancestry.com or anything like that. And Solomon, with the wisdom of God, had the baby brought forward, took a sword, and was going to divide the baby in half. I don't know what good that would do in that sense, because the baby would be dead, neither mother would have a child. But behind it all, God was moving Solomon to begin to maybe do this action, and I don't think God would permit it to take place. And the real mother cried out where the other one did not. And so Solomon had his answer. This is the first example of using God's wisdom, this communicable gift, for the welfare of those citizens that Solomon reigned over. We also see in chapter 4, verse 20, that his fame is increasing and spreading. Verse 20 of chapter 4, Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. They were eating and drinking and rejoicing. Now Solomon ruled over all of the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines, to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed oxen, 100 sheep besides deer, gazelle, roebucks, and fattened fowls. His fame and his prosperity was increasing. Now we see in chapter 6 through 8, and I will not read this, Solomon builds the temple of God. or the temple for God. It was a magnificent structure that Solomon built. And a guy by the name of Haman was contracted to do a lot of the work. And you read through 6 through 8 chapters here, there was not the sound of a chisel in building the temple that was done outside of Jerusalem. And so Solomon is gifted by God with people and with resources to build the temple. And there is a great celebration with thousands of animals being sacrificed. The ark is brought back to the Lord, and he has a prayer of dedication beginning in verse 22. And if you pick it up in verse 21 and read through that on your own, you see the refrain in verse 31, if a man sins. Verse 32, then you hear from heaven that you'll forgive. What about when Israel is defeated by their enemy and they confess? Verse 34, then you will hear from heaven. Verse 37, there's a famine in the land and they confess, then you will hear from heaven. Your people go out to battle against your enemy, then you will hear from heaven. The repeated phrase about Israel's spiritual condition, and when they return, he will hear from heaven, the promise that God will hear from heaven. Now, Solomon's wealth increases according to chapter 10, verse 14 and following. Now, the weight of gold which came into Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold, besides that from the traders and the wares of the merchants and all the kings of the Arabs and the governors of the country. King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold, using 600 shekels of gold on each large shield. He made 300 shields of beaten gold, using 3 minas of gold on each shield, and the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with refined gold. There were 6 steps to the throne, and a round top to the throne at its rear, and arms on each side of the seat, and 2 lions standing beside the arms. 12 lions were standing there on the 6 steps, one on one side and one on the other. Nothing like it was made for any other kingdom. And Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None was silver. It was not considered valuable in the days of Solomon. Verse 30, verse 22 talks about the annual ships bringing things in. Verse 23, King Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And this is because of the hand of God. But Solomon turns from God. Chapter 11, verse 1. Now King Solomon loved many foreign wives, along with the daughter of Pharaoh. And some of these other foreign women were Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon held fast to these in love. So let's look at this a little bit more specifically. Solomon loved many foreign wives. This was prohibited from taking place. All throughout the book of Judges, you see that when Israel got out of the consequences of the discipline of God for the rebellion, and things settled down in their life, they returned to 2 things: idolatry and intermarriage with the foreign women. whether Canaanite, Moabite, Ammonite, whoever it might be. And the idea of here loved is he clung to these women. He held fast to these women. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines who turned his heart away from God. That is in verse 3. That says it very clearly there. 1,000 clamoring females, and I don't care whether they each had their own little studio apartment, they had influence on Solomon and turned his heart away from God. Solomon was an idolater. He built high places for his wives so they could worship their gods, and he would even go out and sacrifice to those high places, which he did at the beginning of his ministry. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and Solomon did not walk in the ways of his father. In Deuteronomy 17:14 is a summation of what we see here in 1 Kings 11. And I want you to note who God is talking to and what is going on. Where are we at in the scriptures? So Deuteronomy 17, verse 14. God is talking to Moses. And Moses is going to talk to the people because God knows they are going to want a king who will go out before them like other nations. Verse 14, God says, when you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, I will set up a king over me like all the nations who are around me. You shall surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Moreover, watch this now, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never again return that way. He shall not multiply wives for himself, otherwise his heart will be turned away, nor shall he greatly increase in silver and gold for himself. And this was given hundreds of years prior to Solomon being born, growing up, being anointed king, starting well, and ending poorly. God forewarned his people that the king should not reflect what Solomon is doing in his diary. 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 26 reinforces Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. All the things that God said don't collect. Now, why? Why did God say don't collect horses, don't collect silver and gold, don't collect wives, etc.? Well, the wives are going to turn your heart away from God, okay? But the collection of horses and the collection of the gold and the silver would give that person a false sense of security that they would be able to handle whatever may come. And the dependency upon God would slowly erode away. And this is exactly what happens in Solomon's life, and that we will read about through the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon was endowed with a spiritual gift, a communicable attribute of God. I explained that to you. And this gift was to be used for the glory of God and the good of those he has given charge over. Now, later on, in the last years of Solomon's life, he had a son called Rehoboam, and he had a very influential slave called Jeroboam. And Jeroboam got tired of the tyranny of Solomon, and he took 10 tribes and went north. When he heard that Solomon died and Rehoboam inherited the throne, he came back and offered to remain as a servant and a slave to Rehoboam under one condition. You do not repeat the ways of your father, because he was harsh and cruel. So the gift that God gave to Solomon was not used for good to those that he was king over. Like Solomon today, we are given a spiritual gift to be used for the glory of God and for good towards those whom God directs to us. And like Solomon, we can drift away and pursue the trinkets of life, thinking they will give purpose and meaning, only to be deceived and left grasping at the wind, frustrated, only to convince ourselves to chase after another vain pursuit. To avoid the Solomon syndrome, we must keep looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, and run our race unencumbered to the end. Thoughts, questions that you might have? Okay, Thursday.
I'm sorry. You don't know the conversation.
Thursday, we are going to continue with the major and minor prophets, and we'll be studying the book of Habakkuk. That's how you pronounce that guy's name, Habakkuk.
Habakkuk.
Habakkuk. Put the emphasis on kuk. I challenge you to read that book, because again, like Nahum and some of the other prophets, Habakkuk speaks to our concerns and our frustrations today with what we see in the world and why God doesn't seem to be doing anything. Sunday, Hebrews chapter 10, we are going to talk about what the law could not do, and that what only Jesus could do. And then Sunday night, John 17. Any thoughts or questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, Pat.
How could Solomon be working for the Lord and had 1,000 women?
Because he was sinful.
Well, that wasn't working for the Lord.
No, the Lord did not want him to have 700 wives and 300 concubines. That was not God's will.
No, certainly not.
Just like these prosperity preachers, it's not God's will for the message that they're preaching and the lifestyle that they're living?
No.
$1 million mansions, $1 million airplanes to fly in, $1 million car. That's not God's will.
No.
If you're being blessed with that much money, look at how much good you could do with that, and how much do you really need to live on? Every Christian needs to determine when enough is enough. And what happens in our culture today, a guy works hard, he's recognized by his boss, he gets an annual review, and he gets a pay raise. Sometimes that's because of inflation and the cost of living, which is something an employer should do. Oftentimes, it's a reward for that employee working for the glory of God. Now, if I do get a substantial raise, as a believer, I need to answer the question, how much is enough? Because oftentimes what takes place, you get a raise, and what do? You increase your lifestyle and spending. I don't believe that's God's will. But that is an individual thing that each person in the work marketplace today has to determine and have to come to a conclusion themselves. Well, that's a great question, Pat. This was not God's will. This was Solomon, who made little decisions early in his life, even though there were high points that he demonstrated God's wisdom. You would think that when God validated his use of wisdom, Solomon would have woke up and say, what am I doing? I don't need all these women. One is enough. but he didn't, because his heart was being turned away from God. See, when you turn your heart away from God, you're looking at an idol that you want more than your relationship with God. That's a mere fact. That's a mere fact. If you don't worship God, you're worshiping something else. That's what Solomon did. Any other thoughts or questions? That was really great, Pat.